It is rather ironic that a country that built an important part of its economic success, military strength, and certainly sort of soft power appeal on research universities that drew people from all over the world now seems to be doing everything it can to drive the successors to those that it attracted, back out of the country, to Canada, to Europe, to Asia. And if that continues for a few years, the world may look very differently. And I think European leaders in universities and in government, as well as in business, should try to take advantage of it, sad as it is that these are the circumstances.
Welcome to Leaders Unplugged. Leaders Unplugged is a real talk with the impactful, candid, honest, actionable, and fresh from behind the scenes. Presented by IMD and hosted by IMD's President David Bach and myself, Felix Zeltner, founder of Remote Daily. Now today, for our fourth episode, we turned the tables again, like in the very beginning of this podcast, and I get the chance to host David and put him on the guest seat. And together, we went from the battle over American academia to his recent trip to the Middle East, all the way to the meaning of good leadership in these times. So here's a bit of context to kick us off. The Trump administration has threatened, and in most cases withheld, billions of dollars in federal grants and contracts from elite colleges in the United States, largely based on allegations of anti-Semitism on campuses. Private institutions like Harvard, Columbia, and Johns Hopkins, and public ones such as the University of Minnesota or UCLA are already affected. The administration also announced grant terminations and the freeze on new grants for far more institutions, including universities in North Carolina, Texas, and Florida. And a few days prior to our recording, more than 150 presidents of US colleges and universities signed a statement together denouncing the Trump administration's, quote, unprecedented government overreach and political interference, unquote. Among the subscribers are the presidents of Yale and Berkeley. David went to both these schools. In Berkeley, he got his PhD, and in Yale, he got his BA, and he returned to work there, actually, for 8 years before joining IMD. So, to kick us off today, I challenged David by saying there is a lot of people who think that taking taxpayer money away from these very wealthy universities, like the ones you attended, these multi-billion-dollar machines, is maybe not a bad thing. It's maybe a good thing, because why would they need public funding? We can use that elsewhere. And I asked David what his response is to people who make this argument.
Well, I completely understand why they would make that argument, but they're mistaken. Now, it's not the public's job to understand how U.S. higher education funding works. I think one of the mistakes that leaders in elite universities in particular have made is to not explain more broadly to the public all the great work that they do, that even though they're a highly selective institution, you take a place like Harvard or Yale or Stanford, they admit 3.5% of the undergraduates who apply there. They're incredibly selective institutions. And yet the research that happens there, the contribution to policy debates, the cultural heritage that gets preserved, all of those things benefit the public. They benefit America. They benefit the world. And, these institutions, I think they all recognize they could have done a better job explaining that more emphatically. One of the things that impresses me about what Harvard is doing right now is they're not just explaining why they're resisting the Trump administration, they're also highlighting how the work that happens at a place like Harvard, work that happens with federal funding, actually benefits the public at large. So basically, to answer your question, for several decades, there's been a close partnership between the U.S. government and these elite research universities, where the U.S. government has underwritten or collaborated with on fundamental research in particular, research that companies wouldn't fund, and that is very expensive, and it would be very difficult for these universities to fund in their own right. Certainly, they couldn't fund it out of tuition, and not every donor is going to fund fundamental research. And so there's been this really important partnership. These universities have built laboratories, have hired faculty, have built whole programs around this research funding. And look, I think if the US wants to have a conversation about the model of research funding at universities, let's have that conversation. Maybe there are better ways of doing this. I would argue that leveraging top research universities is a more effective way of doing that research than, say, government-owned laboratories, which is the model that you see in other parts of the world. But it's okay to have that conversation. But of course, that's not what's happening. The funds are being canceled one day to the next over something, anti-Semitism, that is a really, really important concern, but not related to foundational research on the next generation of antibiotics or research on the origins of the universe, right? These things are not linked. It's being used to pressure these universities. And in the process, this really important work stops. And, I've spoken to colleagues who have described situations where people are literally walking away from petri dishes. There are ongoing experiments that can't come to a conclusion because, funding has disappeared and labs have been shut down.
Wow. And you're also saying that, yes, from a communication standpoint, there could have been a different approach over the last couple of years and maybe being more transparent about where are we using what money. And I think in this letter that I spoke about in the beginning, that these more than 150 university leaders now have signed, it also says, hey, we're willing and able to talk. Let's talk about this, where we use the government money. But the last sentence of this letter says, on behalf of our current and future students and all who work at benefit from our institutions, we call for constructive engagement that improves our institutions and serves our republic. And when I read that, I thought, wow, this is the last phrase of this letter that all these presidents signed. This is the call to action. Do you think, David, that this call for a constructive conversation, quote unquote, is going to work? What do you think is going to happen now?
So I think the constructive conversation is really, really important. And of course, you referred before to their large budgets. You call them multi-billion-dollar enterprises, and that's right. And of course, the numbers that then often get added to this is the amount of endowment, right? So Harvard has over $50 billion in endowment, and so people look at this and say, man, that's more than the GDP of dozens of countries. Clearly they don't need that money. This is a system that is difficult to understand if you're not close to it. And certainly, among European friends, I've frequently found myself shedding a bit of light of this. What this is people making donations, often former students who are grateful for the opportunity that they got. And instead of making a donation that can be spent, right, a spendable gift, they're making a donation to endowment, which means the money gets invested. It generates a return. That return is, often 7, 8, 9% if it's done well. And then the university takes a good chunk of the interests, right, 5, 6, 7% of that, and uses it to fund scholarships, to fund research, to fund activities. And what that means is it funds those things in perpetuity. So there isn't a pot of money sitting in a savings account that the university could just use at any time. The money is invested, and the interests actually constitute for many of these universities about a third of their budgets. It funds scholarships, it funds professorships, it funds programs, it funds research. And so, sure, you can find some ways to dip into this, but you're basically depriving the institution of its opportunities to do this really important work in the future. Again, this is another one of the contributors to why U.S. Elite institutions have been the envy of the world. How is this going to end? I have no idea. I think there are a number of universities, Harvard is one of them, that can withstand that pressure for some time. There are others, like the ones that you mentioned in the introduction, for whom this will mean in the not too distant future some severe cuts in activities, in scholarships, maybe even in academic departments or sort of research programs that they can sustain. And I just hope that enough people recognize that what is happening here is an undermining of one of America's just extraordinary strengths, and that hurting these institutions or crippling these institutions is not in the country's best interest, and that even people who may not have studied there or who may not even aspire to study there recognize that. Now, that requires dialogue. I suspect much of that dialogue is going to be with the public. I assume some of that dialogue may be with members of Congress. I'm not sure how much of that dialogue is actually going to happen with the Trump administration, because there are people in the government who have been very overt about the fact that they're looking to destroy a number of these institutions to send a message. And of course, they want to do that because they view them as predominantly liberal, and so source of potential opposition to what the government is doing. And so if that's the attitude, it's going to be very, very difficult to have constructive conversations.
You gave us this image before of scientists literally walking away from Petri dishes right now because there is no money anymore landing in the bank accounts that would fund their lab. And of course, on your side of the Atlantic, now there is leaders from universities and schools looking at these scientists and saying, if you turn away from your Petri dishes, why don't you come over to us? And there have been calls by a couple of universities from several European countries already to say, how can we together offer American scientists or scientists working in America right now a new home? Is there maybe even a chance to create new grants from the European Union? And it also is somewhat similar to a conversation in the technology industry right now in Europe, where there have also been massive layoffs in the US, and there's the same conversation. Is there a chance we can lure this talent that we have been so envious of over across the Atlantic to us? So how realistic do you think this is?
I mean, I think it's happening, Felix. I mean, we don't know the numbers, but we have lots of anecdotal evidence that leading US scientists are in conversations with top research universities in Europe. I've spoken to a number of university leaders who've confirmed this. You referenced government programs. The French government is working with universities to provide some funding to attract scientists. And you're quite right. I mean, it is to some extent a brain gain or a reverse brain drain, because for so many decades, leading scientists from all over the world, or aspiring scientists, including, of course, from Europe, have gone to the United States. You know, I'll add something that is, perhaps even more startling. U.S. research universities really become the global reference point, in part because during the 1930s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, they became a home for European refugees. You see how the number of Nobel Prizes going to European scientists drops as a result of the disaster in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, fascism and the Second World War, and how it rises in the US afterwards, right? So this doesn't take anything away from what was achieved in the United States to point out that, what helped take U.S. universities to the next level was the influx of scientists who fled Europe. Now, I want to be very careful and not suggest that what is happening in the United States now is comparable to the horrors of 1930s and 1940s Europe. But it is rather ironic that a country that built an important part of its economic success, military strength, and certainly sort of soft power appeal on research universities that drew people from all over the world now seems to be doing everything it can to drive the successors to those that it attracted, back out of the country, to Canada, to Europe, to Asia. And if that continues for a few years, the world may look very differently. And I think European leaders in universities and in government, as well as in business, should try to take advantage of it. Sad as it is that these are the circumstances.
In several industries, there is always a conversation about money when it comes to, is it possible to attract talent from the US? And the end argument is often, well, we just cannot match the salaries that are being paid. Let's say this was the conversation in the technology industry for the last year or so, since there have been massive layoffs. There was always the counter argument, especially from leaders that I listened to in Germany, saying it's just not possible. Maybe we can offer some other things, but we cannot match these salaries. How is that in the academia? Do you think there is the same problem?
Well, I mean, we're not nearly as well paid as our friends in the technology sector. As one of my professors in graduate school pointed out to one of my friends in the PhD program, he said to her, You've already demonstrated an irrational attitude towards money by deciding to pursue a PhD. So we're well paid, but we're not in the same league as some of the tech entrepreneurs you were referring to. So I think on salaries there are clearly some gaps, but what we as academics look for isn't necessarily the highest salary. It's an environment where we're surrounded by amazing colleagues, where we have institutions that support us. But of course, particularly for those in the life sciences, it does require laboratories, staff, right, equipment. And so if we want to attract some of those scientists, particularly in the life sciences and physical sciences, you do need investment in universities. But we should be doing that in Europe anyway to increase our investment in universities, and it might help us attract some top talent from across the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. I want us to pivot at this moment because I thought it was really interesting to talk about regions and also IMD, because I'm learning as we host this podcast together about the vast network that IMD has across the globe. And of course, there's you and many others who have experience in the US, and you're doing a lot of programs on this side of the Atlantic, but you also have a hub in Singapore, and you're very, very active in so many other parts of the globe. And you just returned from the Gulf region, from the Middle East, a region that is changing, that is fascinating, aspiring to many. What were you actually doing there, David? Can you take us into what happened?
Yeah, sure. I was really fortunate to spend 5 days traveling in the Middle East. So I was in Saudi Arabia, I was in Kuwait, and I was in the Emirates. And in the Emirates, I split my time between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And it was a great visit because of the vibrancy of the region. In each of these places, I met IMD alumni. We have strong alumni communities in all of those places. We had a terrific event hosted by the Swiss Embassy at the Swiss Embassy in Riyadh. We had a great gathering in Kuwait. We had a terrific event with alumni in Abu Dhabi. And of course, in addition to meeting alumni and updating them on what's happening at IMD and learning how they're doing and what they're doing, I also met with a number of CEOs of companies that we work with, whose leadership development we support. I met with government officials. I met with some members of the news media to share perspective, and just had conversations about what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Europe, what's happening globally, and what are the opportunities for us to intensify our collaboration.
Now, the Middle East itself is super complex, of course, but the states that you visited in particular are part of the Gulf region, which always seems to impress with speed and optimism and a highly entrepreneurial mindset. Were there any specific moments that stuck with you, that surprised you? Any learnings that you can share? Maybe companies or leaders that you met that should be shared on this podcast, because they're saying if you're a leader right now, you should look at these people and their organizations and what they're doing.
We just talked about the need to increase funding for universities and to invest in research, in science, and in education. And those are priorities in that part of the world. I think that was just so clear, that much of what you described, the vibrancy, the optimism, the can-do attitude, the entrepreneurship, a lot of that just doesn't happen. I mean, it happens because you have government programs, you have the private sector stepping up, and just a lot of investment in education and in research and in the opportunities that generates. And so the trip was full of impressions like this. Again, the optimism that you sense in the region, something that we need to rediscover here in Europe, but also just look, extraordinary things. I mean, I give you just a quick example and then draw a contrast, right? So our son is getting ready to go to college, and so I helped him to apply for a visa, and in order to do that, I had to use the online tool for a country. And I'm not going to tell you what country it is because it's secondary, but it's a rich Western democracy. And it wasn't one tool. I had to use like 3 different websites and programs to set this up. I mean, the e-government platform, one of them looked literally like the internet in 1999. And I contrast this with what I saw in Saudi Arabia, for example. I visit the Saudi Business Center. And the person who showed that to us is a vice minister there, Dr. Iman Al-Mutairi. And it's just extraordinary how she demonstrated how, like, within a matter of just a couple of minutes, you can set up a business, do all of this online, get your licenses, import permits, find the right real estate, and it's all on one platform. And the government has really worked to bring all of this together, both for domestic and international investors. And here we are in the West, and we can't even apply for a passport renewal without getting in a car and like driving somewhere and spending a lot of time, and then it still takes weeks and months. And so what has been happening, particularly around digitizing services, citizen services in that part of the world, is just one of the examples of the sort of forward-looking attitude there. And yeah, you read about it and then you see it and you're like, man, like that's what it looks like when you do this stuff really, really well.
And has your son found a college now?
Well, so he's still trying to figure this out, and of course, the world is more and more turbulent around us, so he's still keeping some of his options open. And yeah, it's a tough decision. I mean, he keeps saying like, this is what is going to determine where I'll spend the next 4 years and the people I'm going to meet. And he's been doing economics as a high-level course in the IB program, and I promise you, Felix, I did not pick his high-level courses, okay? But he's taking economics, global politics, and German, okay? So I mean, again, like I did not pick those for him, but
you're also not unhappy about his.
Look, I mean, we've had great conversations about all kinds of topics as a result of this. But I remember, like, early on in his first year studying economics in high school, and I wish I'd had a chance of studying economics in high school. I did it later on in college, but he said to me like, Dad, man, opportunity costs have changed my life. And he sort of recognized the importance of the concept. And so, poor kid, as he's thinking about college, he's thinking all about opportunity cost. If I do this, I don't do that. And so, it's fascinating seeing your kids sort of try to figure out what the next phase of their life is going to look like, one in which, of course, we as parents have a much smaller role.
And when I think about the people from around the world that are part of IMD's programs, I think about, of course, current leaders of large organizations, but also think about the future generation that is growing up right now. Your son is part of it. And I think about what they learn about leadership at the moment. And this is also how I want to close the podcast today, because a couple of days ago, a fellow management professor at Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania that you and I think many who are listening probably know very well from reading, Adam Grant, published an op-ed in the New York Times, and I thought the title was striking. It said, "America is learning the wrong leadership lessons from Elon Musk." And Adam Grant goes on and says, the way this person deals with people would fail the leadership class that I teach at his alma mater. They actually share the same school for that matter. And then Adam Grant says, for more than a century, my field has studied how leaders achieve great things. I'm quoting now. The evidence is clear. Leadership by intimidation and insult is a bad strategy. Belittling people doesn't boost their productivity, but diminishes it. Now, this might sound banal, but we live in a time, and I'm coming back to IMD, where this kind of leadership by intimidation and insult seems to have success. And I wonder, how does IMD teach, or how does IMD explain this to the aspiring and current leaders that come to IMD to become better?
It's such a great question. And the article, I'm so grateful about the article that Adam wrote. And in fact, I read this article because one of my colleagues shared it on the IMD faculty WhatsApp group. And she said, she's a leadership professor, and she said, I'm sure many of you are getting questions in class about the success of people like Elon Musk and how we explain that he seems to have been so successful despite the fact that he doesn't seem to be adhering to any of the things that we teach about leadership. And you just quoted from Adam's op-ed piece, who highlights this as well. And in the piece, he goes on to spell out what we've learned from empirical research about what makes leaders most effective and why it isn't intimidation and shouting and insulting and so on. So the key word here, I think, is seem, because you say they seem to be successful. It's an attribution error. And I think Adam makes the point very clearly that people like Musk have been successful despite their leadership style and not because of it. And if you look carefully, the leaders who've built long-term sustainable enterprises in which people feel a strong sense of belonging, where they're motivated, where they're inspired, they don't lead this way. I have the good fortune of meeting leaders all the time, and they aren't this caricature of the person in the corner office who shouts and fires people. What they are is people who can inspire, who can energize, who can help their teams make sense of the world, who themselves are vulnerable and aren't afraid to admit that sometimes they don't have the right answer. That's what real leadership looks like, and it's not the caricature that we see on TV when the firing of people gets celebrated and shouting as being described as decisiveness. So what we have to do, and I think one of the really important roles that we have as an academic institution that is engaged in research and in teaching, is to show the data. We can show what a difference it makes when people are motivated. We can show what kind of leadership motivates people. We can show what happens to organizations, at least what is more likely to happen to organizations who have abusive leaders who create toxic cultures, right? What happens when talent leaves, when people are afraid to speak out, and because of that, mistakes become more likely and scandals become more likely, and so on. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the work that we do here at IMD. We don't preach. We engage. We challenge. We inspire. We take our participants on a journey with us to show them what decades and centuries of studies of leadership and effective leadership have revealed. But clearly we're sometimes swimming against the current, and the coverage sort of in the media and in Hollywood and elsewhere of what leadership supposedly looks like is one of those countercurrents that we have to address.
I find it so powerful that you and also Adam Grant are saying these people are successful despite of how they lead, not because of how they lead. And it's crazy to imagine how much more success or impact they could have with a different way of leading. Do you actually have a definition of good leadership that's like maybe in one sentence or on one phrase?
Yeah, I picked it up from one of my colleagues. I'm so fortunate to be surrounded by amazing colleagues. And one of them said to me, leadership is about two things. It's direction and energy. Leaders are supposed to point the way and say, this is where we're trying to go, and then energize people, bring them together, align them, inspire them, and help them get there. And that's not a one-time thing. As the world changes, you might have to change direction a little bit, and you might have to say, look, we thought we were going to go there, but we have to go a little bit more over here. So the direction, of course, may have to change as the world changes. And so your job as a leader is to be sort of the chief sense maker, but of course, just as importantly, the energizing is not just a one-time thing. You have to continuously do that, meet people where they are, take an interest in them, understand what they're dealing with, and then support them in their work. Lead by example, make sure that your behaviors are conveying what the organization is all about. So, when I think about how should I be spending my time, I keep coming back to, am I giving direction? And am I energizing the community? And it sounds simple, but every leader you'll speak to is going to tell you it's really, really hard, because sometimes you don't know exactly where we need to go. And you yourself may feel a little drained, and yet it is so important that you're the person who can articulate where we're trying to go as a team, as an organization, and then energize people to get there.
As the president of IMD, which of the two do you find more challenging, energy or direction?
I find sustaining both of them really hard. I mean, what I said there towards the end, that this isn't a one-time thing. It's something that you have to continue to do. That's what I'm learning in this job, right? That somebody said this to me recently, like, strategy is not a promise, strategy is a hypothesis. Like, we have a hypothesis that this is what is going to make us successful in this world, but we have to keep revisiting it, right? So you have to keep revisiting the direction part. Of course, you can't change your mind constantly and say left, right, now turn around, backwards, right? That doesn't work. But you have to be able to take in new information and to pivot a little bit. But the energizing, you got to keep at it. And sometimes in a leadership role, you're drained, right? I mean, you hear this often. It's a bit of a cliche, but all the problems end up on your desk, because if somebody could have solved them before, they wouldn't have gotten to your desk. And that's also true. And so you probably get a disproportionate share of bad news, and that can be draining. And then the rest of the organization, your team, looks at you as a source of energy and inspiration. So it's hard to keep that up. So I find both of them challenging, particularly continuous direction giving and energizing I find challenging, but I also find it incredibly rewarding, because you can see what happens. And it doesn't need to be enterprise level leadership. In a small team, if you help people figure out where we're trying to go together, and you energize and motivate them to do that, it's awesome. It's incredibly gratifying. So yeah, it's hard, but it should be hard.
Last question, David. Now, when people walk out of your office, is there a belief sign over your door, like Ted Lasso has it? Or what is your mantra poster that you put up for your colleagues at IMD?
Well, I told you that I find Ted Lasso incredibly inspirational as a leader. We had a conversation about this, so I'm glad you bring up Ted Lasso, and I'm thrilled that there's going to be a new season. And I hope our listeners don't believe that I think we need to go to television to find inspirational leaders. What I like about Ted Lasso is, he exhibits many of these things that I talked about, right? Clear direction. This is what we're going to do. Energizing. I believe in you, right? And here's why you should believe in yourselves. And of course, there's a humility about him that I find endearing. And my colleagues actually have taken some of the lessons from Ted Lasso and sort of brought them into the classroom. But of course, there are hundreds, there are thousands, tens of thousands of Ted Lassos in so many organizations, public and private, for-profit, nonprofit. And so, it's just nice to have that sort of alternative visualization or sort of leadership than what we discussed previously about these sort of alpha males who are shouting around. Real leadership is a lot closer to what Ted Lasso does. But let's put the show aside. I don't have a sign above my door that says believe, but I have a Post-it on my monitor, and it's the only Post-it that I have on my monitor. And I wrote it down when I was offered this job, and this is something that a board member said to me that I needed to have, constantly front and center, and it's been incredibly valuable. And it literally says, what is it that only I can do? And the only is underlined twice. And it's not that, I have some extraordinary gift. That's not the point of that statement at all. It's that you really need to think hard as a leader and continuously ask yourself, is this the best use of my time? And are there other people in the organization who can do this? And if there are other people in the organizations who can do that, they should. It doesn't mean that they have to do it as well as you or that they would do it exactly the same way, but if they can do it, they should. You need to focus on the things that nobody else can do, either because of skills, but just as importantly, because of the role that you have, right? There's certain things that you can do as a leader of an organization that is just much harder to do for anybody else. And so I keep asking myself, what I'm doing right now, is that something that only I can do? Or should I think about who else in the organization is better positioned to do it? So that's my mantra, at least in my first year on the job, until I fully internalized this.
Wow. I'm glad I get the chance to ask you and host you on Leaders Unplugged. And thank you, David, for your time and your insights. I can't wait for the next episode. Is there any teaser you want to give us?
Well, so I'll be getting on the road again, this time in the other direction. So I headed east to the Gulf region last. Now I'm going to head west to the Americas, and I'll try to bring back some insights from there.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, David.
Thank you.